This is the vlog for May 29th, 2018. And I think there's just a jet going by overhead. Sun won't be down for another half hour or so, but it's very dark now. It was cloudy today, as was forecast. It broke up a little bit in the middle of the day, but it's cloudy now. I was going to go for a walk, and then it just didn't look very promising, and it's quite cool and breezy now. So, let's see here. I'm going to put this on Do Not Disturb. So, couple things. I got a notification that I didn't notice until this morning's email that somebody had left a comment on my video from a few days ago, asking me if I'm the Eric Spornitz that went to Gleason Lake Elementary in Plymouth, Minnesota, which is a very curious question because I did, but I only went there for about a year and a half. So story time. When we lived in Minnesota when I was a kid, we went to a school that was called Wayzata. It was spelled Wayzata or Wayzata, but everybody I knew pronounced it Wayzata. And I went to Wayzata Elementary School. Well, Wayzata Elementary School was very old. It was sort of a cool old building. And it was the first elementary school I ever went to, so I really didn't have anything to compare it to at the time. It had sort of spackled walls that gave it an almost adobe sort of feel, and the water tasted terrible. It had copper pipes that were just really gross. I did not like using the water fountain, and I was encouraged to use the water fountain a lot. And it was so old, and I think I remember hearing rumors that there was asbestos found somewhere in the building. I doubt it, because I've lived to be 37 years old, and I've never noticed anything related to asbestos poisoning. So it's probably not true, but who knows? They closed it down. They closed it down the year I was in third grade. So I started my third grade year at Wayzata Elementary, and then they sent everybody to a new school that had been built much closer to where I lived, called Gleason Lake Elementary. I don't know if I've mentioned Gleason Lake before on this channel, but during the summer, it was customary for me and my friends to get on our bikes. This is when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. We'd follow a trail at the back end of the neighborhood we lived in on our bikes through basically the brush on a tiny little eroded dirt trail that has since been paved, I've found, just looking at it on Google Earth. Yeah, seriously. We went through that trail and got on a new street and went to a little park called Queensland Park. No relation to the Australian state. That park had another trail in the back of it that led to another development, and that development was across the street from Gleason Lake Elementary. Gleason Lake itself was, they call Minnesota the land of 10,000 lakes, and that's being very generous to some of these things. Gleason Lake would probably be what you or I would call a pond. It was a very big pond, but it didn't really feel like a lake. It had a lot of houses around the edges of it, but yeah, so there was a bridge over the lake that ran along a path that ran next to the school. If it sounds like there were a lot of paths, there were. And when I was a kid, and when you were a kid in the 80s, we didn't have, one of us had video games, and we didn't get to play them all the time. And we went outside for most of our fun. And going on this bike ride was a great way to spend a day. Our parents were sort of okay with it because it was really good exercise. We'd be out biking for 4 hours or so, but they were a little worried because once we got past Gleason Lake, we were we followed a trail that went across a busy avenue and then eventually looped around another lake called Parker Lake. And we would loop all the way around Parker Lake, get back on the trail, cross the street again, ride down another mile past Gleason Lake Elementary, through a tunnel under the busy street that separated the development from the school. Our parents liked that tunnel because it meant we were not on the street itself. And then twisting and turning through all the trails to get back home again. The whole thing, like I said, took about 4 hours. I want to say, I think we measured it out to be about 9 miles, maybe 10 miles. Like I said, that's a lot of exercise for a kid. But we got to ride full speed most of the time on those trails because a lot of them were very straight. And when we were in the developments, we were just using the street very carefully, avoiding cars. Sometimes I think it's a wonder that we didn't get hit while we were biking around in the neighborhoods themselves. One of the kids I knew, his little brother was hit by a car, but he was just playing in the street. He was maybe 5 years old or 6 years old at the time. And that was, not great. That was the last year I lived there. But yeah, Gleason Lake. Hello, Alicia. So I hate to say it, but I don't actually remember anybody in my 3rd or 4th grade classes at all. The kids that I grew up with were in different grades, so we never shared a class in elementary. And the one good friend that I had, I didn't make until I went to a different school called Oakwood. And yes, I did go to one school for 2 years, 2.5 years, another school for another year and a half, and then a third school the last year I lived in Minnesota. They could not figure out where to stick us. They kept rearranging the lines that determined who got to go to what school. Oakwood was the closest one of the 3 that I went to, which begs the question, why was I not going there from the start? I'll never know. And I honestly don't think anybody in Minnesota knew what they were doing either. So, I think it's really cool that somehow I was remembered. I did a little bit, hopefully this isn't considered stalking. I Googled the name of the person that sent me the question, and sure enough, they're my age. They're 37 years old. They still live in Minnesota, and they went to Wayzata High School. That was all I could learn about Alicia. And it's just astounding that if you're watching this, it's astounding to me that you remember me. I hesitate to ask why. I don't think I was that extraordinary back in 1988. But I sort of vaguely remember my teacher. I think her name was Mrs. Kozłowski. She was a very sweet woman who was very patient with me at a time when I needed somebody to be very patient with me. And I do sort of remember a couple people in that class. Not faces, just sort of the conversations we had. I sort of remember a girl named Jill, but I don't remember. It's a hazy point in my life. I remember playing with the neighborhood kids. I remember staying out late in the summer, getting yelled at by our parents for staying out late, getting yelled at by our parents when we went across that street when it was super busy. Going in the middle of the day was the safe bet because there weren't a lot of people. Everybody was working. Not a lot of people using the street, even in the summer. But I watched The Goonies today, which is a movie that came out in 1985. I would have been 4 years old at that point. Interesting cast. I had forgotten that Sean Astin is the main character, Mikey. Josh Brolin is his big brother, Brandon. Corey Feldman is a kid they nicknamed Mouth, and a fellow who did some child acting but didn't end up doing anything later, played a character named Chunk, who is probably one of the more memorable characters in the movie. But I found Chunk's behavior to be sort of frustrating. If you compare the kids in uh, in the Goonies to the kids in Stephen King's It, uh, Ben is the overweight kid in It, and he's very smart. And I think that's a bit more fair to the as somebody who was heavy set growing up. I found that those of us who sort of had weight problems when we were very young had to get clever or we were going to be in trouble. And I took me a long time to sort of figure that out. And I do remember being very, is it weird to say, I remember being annoying. And it's embarrassing to think of the things that I did and the way I acted. Because the problem is when you're overweight and you're a kid, a lot of people don't want to waste their time with you. They don't want to take you to the side and say, look, kid, you have to do this and this, or people are going to treat you terribly. And a couple people did, and eventually I sort of figured it out when I was in junior high. So it took another 5 years to really sort of understand what my place was going to be in the world. But the rest of the movie is really good, with the one sort of caveat that I didn't remember it being so many scenes of all these boys trying to shout over each other at the same time. So a lot of the dialogue is just, random shouting, and there's a lot of action happening. It feels very honest. It feels like these, like you knew these kids. And I hesitate to think that I was the chunk growing up. I really sort of feel for Sean Astin's character because I was, a dreamer. I thought a lot about things. I had a very active imagination. And I think that, too, is something that Ben from It and I shared. He had a fondness for books and reading and architecture, something I don't have any professional interest in architecture, but I've always liked well-designed buildings and structures, just really good engineering in general. But yeah, I was not the big Bill of the It, and I was not the leader of the group, even though I was the oldest. The leader of the group was the little shit who just about I think every parent in the neighborhood hated him, but he was the one that got us to do stuff, and he had this weird, gross obsession with the sort of skater culture of the 80s. Yeah. Anyway, I've gone well over my time. But Alicia, if you decided to watch another one of these, feel free to hit me up in comments or message me. I think my email might be available through YouTube being associated with Google, but otherwise, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. And for you and the rest of you, I'm Eric Spornitz, and tomorrow will be better.